Hello, so I'm Rowan from Scrutinise This, a film podcast where we critique all types of films, but in this series, the Oscar nominees ahead of the big ceremony in March. So on the panel, we have Dennis Hottie, our cinema savant, we have Bardi Hassani, our resident film novice, and today we will be dissecting Oppenheimer, a film by Christopher Nolan. And similar to the film itself, we will be quite conflicted, and we'll also be dropping some pretty fucking big bombs, so stay tuned to find out. Live. Cool.
All right.
Bardi, take it away.
Perfect. So, I'm going to run through some questions that I've been eager to know as a film novice. Okay. So, we're doing the Oscar specials. So, firstly, what I want to know is, why are the Oscars so important? Why are they the highest, like they're sort of the creme de la creme of awards when it comes for movies? That's the notion I get from it. But why is it so important? I want to know.
All right, Dennis.
Well,
Let's
this
go you
question.
first.
Hold on. So, is this falling on me then?
I mean, is this for both of us? Because I
This
have
is
some
for
thoughts.
Well, I want both of you to answer. You might have different opinions. You may disagree.
Okay.
You may agree. I want to know what your views
I'm a
are.
little bit cautious of this getting within an hour because we could ramble on for ages.
I mean,
but it's a good question though.
I can do a quick rundown of it. I mean, based on my knowledge of it, obviously, Ron, you can cut in if you feel like there's something I'm missing. But to sort of, like you said, for the sake of time, the Oscars. I mean, the thing is, it's even in the wording a little bit because it's not. It's the most famous. I'm sure that's probably the correct way to say it. But in terms of the prestige, there's probably things that overtake it. But I mean, the question that you're asking really is that why is Hollywood the sort of home of film? Because the Oscars is basically a celebration of Hollywood. So basically, you have, I mean, Hollywood forms. Yeah, I mean, basically a few years before Hollywood. We're talking about Hollywood, not the place, but it as a film. As a home of film. And then the Oscars is kind of, it aligns itself at the same time with the birth of Hollywood and then the birth of things like star power. And it's probably the only award ceremony. Obviously now we have things like Grammys and Emmys and stuff like that, but it's only probably the single film ceremony that's actually watched and people go in and they watch it from a star point of view, from a cultural point of view, from a film point of view. There's people who log in just to watch the red carpet element of it. People who are into fashion will watch the red carpet. People who are into gossip will watch it and see, who's he come with, who's she come with, and then obviously there's the film element. But yeah, it just seems like, I guess, lightning in a bottle in the beginning, and then all the sort of things fell into place. But I think a lot of film buffs probably wouldn't consider it the most prestigious.
The fact, if you're not a film buff and you want a quick list of films to watch and who you kind of a list which you kind of respect, then you would normally go to the Oscar nominees. It's like a quick way of kind of like a reflection on popular culture and what trends are in, political trends or film art trends, or what celebrities are hot at that moment.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget that it attracts like the best talent in fashion. It attracts the best talent in music.
Music, for sure.
And obviously the best talent in actual Hollywood. So
it expands more than just films.
Yeah, because it becomes culturally significant. Because, like I said,
even in later years, it's become more of an international thing. You have like Parasite and films which are not even American, right?
I mean, most of the world will look to the Oscars as the benchmark of mainstream cinema, right? So yeah, I think it's all of those reasons. So I guess no matter, I mean, we can obviously discuss the films here, but I think getting an Oscar nominee since, I mean, you said it came out in the 20s all the way till now, it has huge significance on your own star power and on the presence of your film. So I guess
Best Picture will earn like 4 times the amount of money. Like the financial benefits of winning Best Picture are huge. So
what do you mean when you mean they get more money? Will they get paid on top of that?
Well, more people will watch it. It will be downloaded. Right. It will just the amount of buzz will just be huge, right?
Right.
So, but especially think of it if you're a a South Korean director and you've made Parasite, you can win every kind of festival going. You can win Venice and you can win Berlin prizes, but to get Best Picture, that means that the mainstream audience are exposed to your film. So, you're thrown into another level. Okay, look, if Avatar wins Best Picture, it may not have a huge impact on its sales. I mean, it could do, actually, because it could draw in more artistic people and so on. But for films that are a bit more, indie films that end up doing well, or lower budget films that end up doing well, they end up being catapulted into sort of
and it also means
history.
that the director Bong Joon-ho could literally just go to Hollywood and work in a huge budget, because he's won Best Picture. Now he has the credibility to do.
It's opened all the doors for him. You can basically
Completely.
kind of do what you want in terms of artistically.
Bardi now is going to be like, I'm just going to win an Oscar then. It's much
Well,
easier.
if it's so easy, I was going to get one then.
But
okay.
I think that kind of
That encapsulates it.
the question. Yeah, there's obviously thousands of other. There's obviously micro little moments that have sort of been, they've entered sort of cultural history, I guess.
Yeah.
Micro little moments. There's been things like famous speeches, and there's been even.
And it's kind of become like memeified, right? In the last years, they're trying to keep it. They're trying to keep it relevant.
Will Smith got up and slapped Chris Rock. You know what I mean? Like that.
Well,
when you think about it, it's irrelevant to film. On the sort of face of it, and it ended up being, one of the biggest
it's pretty
cultural
pretty
moments ever.
Rowan touched on a point earlier where he said, if someone wants quick results to find out what good movies are, who's looking to get into film, they will usually go for Oscar winners. And not to shy away from the Oscar theme that we have here, but if you had to just pick one other festival which you think is just as important as the Oscars, that people who want to get into film should go and research, what would you guys recommend?
Well, we'll probably say the same thing, being the Cannes Film Festival, just because a lot of the other festivals, BAFTAs, and sort of Golden Globes, they kind of fall in the same camp and they follow each other a little bit. Okay. So whereas the Cannes Film Festival is pretty consciously trying to be different to the Oscars. They usually make more, usually award more independent films, more kind of films of the fringes. If you look at the winners recently, they've been very different to the winners of the Oscars.
But also, it's worth noting though that Rowan's, I think he's right, but it's worth noting that the Oscars and things like even Emmys and anything like that, BAFTAs, they're not really actually even the same thing as film festivals. Just because if anyone ever has a chance to visit Cannes Film Festival or Venice or Sundance or any of these sorts of or even more local festivals, those are celebrations of film and filmmaking, so they'll encompass loads of things all to do with film. Obviously there's star power. Cannes Film Festival, as far as European star power is concerned, is up there. But if you attend something like, let's say, Venice Film Festival, you go to seminars, you go to screenings, you go to see short films, you go
there's
to
like Q&As and everything, right?
There's Q&As. Exactly. You speak directly to filmmakers. You speak directly to, people who are involved in, even people. You have runners that get together and they, meet up and do things. It's way more of a festival. So I think anyone who's interested in film as an art form, or even from a technical point of view, it's a whole different world from something like the Oscars. The Oscars, a lot of the time, they will rush through like 8 of the categories that are technical because it's all about, the juice of Best Actor and so on. And obviously, as we talk about Oppenheimer, we'll get to one of the big problems with the Oscars is it the best of that year? Is it the best performances of that year, or is it the best marketing of that year? What exactly are we going to obviously discuss here? But we'll get into Oppenheimer and see.
Yeah, or is it the culmination of one person's career or a movement or other things? Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's definitely jump into straight away to the Oppenheimer questions, which is what this episode is about. So, firstly, obviously, Christopher Nolan says that his first encounter with the name Oppenheimer came from lyrics from a song from, I think, Sting. And now, personally, I'd never heard of Oppenheimer before. Okay.
Oh, really?
I'd never heard of it before. So I went to the cinema, I watched it. Of him.
Of him.
Of
the
him.
actual
Apologies.
historical figure. Okay.
Yeah, I'd never
Okay.
heard of Oppenheimer. Obviously, I knew that this film was coming out, but I didn't know what it was about, who he was. So I went to the cinema, I watched it, and then I read up on him, and then I watched it on the cinema again. So I had the chance to go and view it twice in the cinema. But were you guys aware of Oppenheimer, who he was, and or anything like that before the movie came out?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. I knew a little bit about the history, but that's not a reason not to be interested more, because he's obviously a really pivotal figure, right?
Yeah.
And obviously a very conflicted and interesting guy. So yeah, I did know, but there was definitely a movie there. So
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, away from film, I do like history, World War Two, kind of World War One, World War Two history. So I actually knew quite a bit about Oppenheimer going into the film. I had actually when the film was announced, my gut instinct was I hope that they don't try and trivialize this character, because it is a great series of events and it's a complex character. So yeah, I did know quite a
did you
bit
know about
it
Lewis
going.
Strauss though?
You know what? I have to
No.
admit, I actually did know about Louis Strauss, and
Really?
it's pronounced Strauss. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, my listening of classical music, obviously.
Yeah. I actually did. You know what? I knew a considerable amount. A considerable amount. But the funny thing was that I had never. I'd first picked up on him in listening to these history audiobooks I've been listening to for a few years, and it's funny because when I saw that Robert Downey Jr. plays him, it was like I was like, oh, I didn't envisage this character as being in any way Robert Downey Jr. ish. But we'll get into. I mean, we'll get into see the performances. But yeah, I knew quite a bit about the topic.
Okay, great, perfect. Well, I mean, we can jump in straight away because the next question for me, I mean, it's kind of like an all-star cast. There's so many famous people in that. And what were your thoughts on casting? You know, like you said, you didn't envision Robert Downey Jr. being in that role. I thought it was a great performance all round from everyone, from especially Cillian Murphy, if I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yeah.
And Matt Damon. A favorite of mine was Casey Affleck's little scene that he has.
He's in that for a bit.
I
Yeah.
thought he was
great in
brilliant
that,
in it. I think that scene was amazing. But what did you guys think of the casting? And obviously, some of them have been nominated for Oscars.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how many cameos are in that film, and you kind of don't even realize they're there. Like, especially Harry Truman, right, played by Gary Oldman.
Amazing cameo. Yeah. Amazing cameo.
There's something in his eyes, you can see it's good old Oldman, but especially he's such a chameleon. So
Yeah, it took me a minute. It took me when I saw him, I was like, wow, I said that looks a lot like Gary Oldman. But then I put two and two together because I thought it's Nolan and it's Oldman, you know, so it's bound to be him.
it would work. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's in terms of the actors doing their jobs, yeah, I think they do a good job. Yeah, I think Cillian Murphy is always he's always on in a way. He's always on as Oppenheimer. There's never a point where he's not convincing in that role. I mean, this is not Cillian Murphy's fault. It's more, I think, the director's fault. It would be nice just to see him just being a bit not looking conflicted the whole fucking time. I know that's the point of the film, but it seems like he was kind of a little bit constipated and the whole time. Just seemed it seemed a little bit like I wanted a bit more breathing space with him, just to kind of relax a little bit and see a different side of him, because he's very fraught the whole movie. And I don't blame Cillian Murphy for that. It seems like the way Nolan makes his films, we're not given enough time to see a different side of him.
Okay, so you would want to see a different side of Oppenheimer, so not just when he's concentrating.
A more rounded human being, right?
Okay.
Because everything is the whole bomb exploding and the Trinity the Trinity project is just tarring the whole film. It kind of, I mean, it's obviously a big deal, but there will be points in his life where I want to see a bit more realism. Like, he doesn't have to be worried about this one event the whole time.
Okay. Dennis, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, to be honest, I'd not ever thought about it in the way that Rowan's just said. I don't think Rowan's necessarily wrong. I think it's a conscious decision though by Nolan. It doesn't seem like. I mean, look for all.
It's very subjective, right? But if you look at something like Napoleon, which obviously isn't doing as well in the Oscars, you get a sense of Joaquin Phoenix he has a boyishness. It's not all serious warmongering, right? It's not all serious commanding the French whatever battalions. He's like he's throwing food at people. He's and he's having weird sex. I kind of like seeing all these multiple dimensions of a character which is flawed as well as courageous and all that stuff. Whereas with Oppenheimer, it was consistently fraught and consistently morally conflicted the whole time. Even when he's having sex with Tadlock and they're sort of running off the Bhagavad Gita. Hope I pronounced that right. It was the same person the whole time. I wanted a bit more development.
Yeah. But what about Robert Downey Jr. then and Louis Strauss?
Oh right, yeah. I mean, yeah. One of my gripes with the film is I just don't care about that character as much as Oppenheimer. Right? I don't know why. I don't know why there's so much screen time on Strauss. Obviously, the book Strauss or Strauss. Sorry, let's clear that up. Strauss.
So there's no owl. There's no owl. It's normally like Louis Strauss, but it's Strauss. I think here there's a big shadow being cast over the film, which is Christopher Nolan, because Christopher Nolan, his style was so pronounced when it comes to the way he displays characters and the way he sort of molds those characters into a plot. And I started reading American Prometheus after watching the movie. So if you ever get the chance to read American Prometheus, it goes without saying, it's 1,000 times more in depth than obviously what the film goes into, and that's a given because it's a book that explores a lot more of the topics. But to quickly go back, we're talking about the Louis Strauss character. I mean, his role in the sort of Oppenheimer world is hugely relevant, and obviously the film tries its best to squeeze sort of those two out. Obviously, it has a lot of those sort of auxiliary kind of satellite characters around, but obviously those two are the back and fro of it all. But the way that Nolan makes things is this kind of, it's almost a bit almost like Terrence Malick style, of that he has his own direction very clearly in his head. He knows where this film needs to go, and a lot of the time he limits performances in a way that I think isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think a lot of good directors, even people like Tarantino, they tend to do this, which is they almost sort of turn the actor's head and just say, look, you just face that way. And obviously what that ends up doing is characters will feel a bit flat after the fact. You watch it and you think, oh, really, all we ever see is him sort of moaning and griping. But it helps the sort of scope of the film, I think, because the mood that he's going for, he always manages to achieve, I think.
It's such an intricate web of subplots, and obviously you have the fission and the fusion, both those plots, and every scene has to be so clinically done. And it's obviously a long film, right? I just don't think. I think your point about it restricting performance is true, and that's partly the reason why I have a problem with Nolan's films. I don't think that he gives enough time for scenes or really characters to develop, like they should.
Yeah, he'll often just present, and I'm mixed on this. I think, look, you have some directors who love to explore all the sort of waves of a character's emotions and everything, but Nolan tends to present us with a kind of obviously there's a sort of central premise. He's a very central premise kind of director, and then I think clinical is the right word. You can see in the editing and the style of the filmmaking that he is a clinical director. He seems like someone who once he's behind the camera and he's felt the beat has been hit, he's probably just says cut, move to the next scene. He's just rolling through those emotions.
Sorry guys, just to interrupt. What do you guys mean by a clinical director? What compared to what? If we had to compare it between something.
if you look at the length of each scene in something like Oppenheimer, it's
Yeah.
obviously a 3-hour movie, but even still, it's quite short. It's quite direct, and it's quite and it's, the set pieces are all quite. Things happen quickly, and it kind
Okay.
of brushes over the narrative. Kind of brushes over things quite quickly. For me, I like scenes to develop. I like moods to develop, and I like characters to develop. And if you kind of flit around the chronology so much, and you're obviously covering a lot of stuff, but you're not covering the journey of things like other films do. So yeah, he's a clinical director, but I don't think that doesn't add to the film for me.
Okay. So would you say because the scenes are quite short, it doesn't allow the viewer to be emotionally attached to the scene or the person or the character that's going on because it's quite quick and quite direct?
Yeah, I mean, and is that coupled with the fact you have so many themes you're exploring as well, which doesn't have they're not obviously mutually exclusive, but he's throwing in a lot of sort of things about, he obviously has a lot of like the whole historical events he has to check off. He has things about the whole theory of quantum physics, and he has so much to cover as well. And I like characters ultimately. I like moods, and he doesn't. It just doesn't give himself enough to develop.
Okay.
The only thing that I will interject a little bit is, I mean, I agree overall, but quickly to answer Barty's question about a clinical director, if you think back, Barty, films that you've seen or people listening to this, the films that they've seen,
Yeah.
you sometimes, I mean, look, ultimately what's happened behind the camera, we can't be privy to that. I mean, even if there's a behind the scenes, we can't ultimately be privy to the process. So the clinical feel of it, and here I'm using clinical, I think we're both, Ron and I, using clinical here in terms of not what you see on the screen. We don't mean clinical in a kind of something like Gone Girl or something like that, something like procedural, but we mean clinical in the style of directing. And to me it feels like Nolan's he's taken this script, he's got all these sort of points that he believes are going to make this film the film that he wants to see at the end of it, and he doesn't allow for a lot of maneuvering there. He seems like someone who's got control over every facet of it. If you think back to certain other directors who I'm going to try and come up with names now, it's always hard on the spot to think of particular films, but you have directors who you can see they let their actors, let's say Scorsese is another big name, right? For me, I'd say he's still, look, obviously he's got creative control and he's a brilliant sort of directing mind, but you can see that he gives people like his actors, his costume designers and people like that, you can see he gives them a bit of a free rein, to say, look, bring something more to this performance, bring something. So
you'll have like Woody Allen, who's like the right at the other end, he just lets his actors do everything.
Exactly.
Or loads of improv, which I kind of veer towards that direction. But Nolan is like a tightly performing orchestra of instruments, right?
I see.
So for people who watch football, because I used this in a Letterboxd review recently. For people who watch football, they'll know this reference, right? You have free flowing football. You have managers who will say to their team, "Look, we've got attackers who are creative and they can do this." They'll say, "Get the ball to the attacker, let them create." Nolan is the sort of manager who he'll say to his team, "Look, you have to sit in a low block, and we're going to win this on set pieces, and we're going to win this in these things that we've done on the training field. These are the things that are going to win us the game." And Nolan, I mean, and it shows because, for example, a Nolan set piece, in my opinion, is the best in Hollywood. I think that when you feel a set piece coming in a Nolan film, and interestingly, we'll get to specifically to scenes in Oppenheimer, because I think Oppenheimer is the one film where he doesn't do this as much, but it has its benefits. But if we look at something like Inception, we look at Interstellar, The Dark Knight is a great example. When he starts to build the set pieces, you can feel the whole cinema holds its breath because he's so good at carrying out these set pieces. He knows how to work music, sound, performance, everything down to the shots. I mean, obviously he's filming this, the more recent films in 75mm, and it's like they're pure set pieces. He's so good at them, and to be so good, you have to have control over every element. And I think he does do that. And you even see, if you watch interviews with people like Hans Zimmer, he'll even say, he's like, look, I'm the composer, but a lot of the ideas come from Nolan, right? He came up with this sound, and he thought of this and he thought of that. So you can see this is a mind who he's got such a clear image of what he wants, and it tends to be a trait of a good director. People like Tarantino, Fincher, and Nolan in this case, their sort of knowledge of that film that they're making, the whole world of that film is, like a mastermind, right? So
yeah, I would argue you have directors like P.T. Anderson who I would say are better at scene building and sort of being that like that conductor of a big orchestra sort of thing.
I also agree that I think that Paul Thomas Anderson is also a master.
But he doesn't stoop to bending the chronology 1,000 ways and trying to sort of confuse things, which Nolan does quite a lot. He's a big chronology bender and weaver, which kind of pisses me off. Even from you have Memento, his opening film, which is it's one of my favorite of his films. But that film obviously goes backwards. He loves changing things up. But the thing is, the emphasis then is on chronology rather than the actual themes of the film. You have a film like P.T. Anderson, who I mentioned, who did something like The Master, a very straightforward chronological film. But then what comes to the fore in the audience's mind and in our minds is the actual themes, the themes that he brings up, as well as the performances. You have obviously Joaquin Phoenix and who's Philip Seymour Hoffman. Yeah, it allows it to grow, and I think P.T. Anderson, if we can say he's the best at that, I would say he's the best at that particular thing.
I mean, look, Paul Thomas Anderson's ability to sort of craft set pieces. I mean, he's got a great one in There Will Be Blood. People have seen that film. I'd say one of the best. I mean, you think back on it, it's like he gets a set piece out of the well exploding, and he builds it with a few sounds. He's a master. But the thing that Nolan is able to do that none of those other names that you mentioned is able to do, and I think for this he gets massive credit, is that Nolan is someone who, I mean, look, obviously he makes a lot of money and he has a huge fan base.
That's not a good enough reason for me to like a director.
But he does. But hold on. But I was going to say he does that, but he doesn't necessarily shy away from topics that haven't been presented on the screen, and I think that is an important distinction. Now, I'm not saying that. I mean, obviously, with Oppenheimer, there are some important political. I don't want to say that he shies away from them, but there are some important political points that Nolan. He doesn't let his film completely confront those problems, and I think there's also an element of this isn't a 10-hour sort of documentary piece, but he's clearly a director who he wants ideas that he hasn't seen on screen. Obviously, he's got full of references and influences and things like that, but he wants to bring ideas that are not on screen. And Oppenheimer is a hugely important character. The Trinity test is one of the most important political moments in world history. But there are not a lot of films that are actually about that moment, right? You'd think there would be a lot more. You've got a lot of films about the Holocaust. You've got a lot of films about World War II. But the Trinity test and things like that, there's not a lot. And he's obviously someone who he wants to sort of face that challenge, but do it in a way that he thinks obviously is punchy and it still stays true to that subject matter. Obviously, it's impossible to do a topic like this without encroaching on political matters. And obviously, one of the differences from reading American Prometheus, studying Oppenheimer, and obviously watching the film is obviously his views towards things like Japan and his own Jewish background and World War II and things like that. The film touches on it, but obviously we don't go deep into it. But I have
There's
huge
so much
respect
to go deep into, and I think there was just too much dross and not enough of these different sides of Oppenheimer.
You know, the Strauss is actually my favorite thing about the movie, and I'll tell you why.
No, irrespective of Downey Jr., because he's obviously doing a good job, but he doesn't. He's kind of a one-dimensional prosecutor / committee leader or whatever. He's not really.
Yeah,
I don't see him having much depth to it.
yeah. This is partly, I think, a bit of obviously the shame of. I mean, ultimately, it's still a long film, but I mean, short of making it 5 hours, it's hard to really go into the lives of people like Louis Strauss, who has a interesting. If people are interested, he's got a very interesting.
He should have his own biopic, I think. Then.
Backstory and possibly, but the one thing I was going to say that the reason why I love the Strauss character and why it's a very Nolan thing to do is Nolan, away from the Dark Knight trilogy, he loves to subvert the antagonist role, and what you'll see in a lot of his films is that as opposed to having, let's say a normal baddie, let's say you watch like Heat is a great film, but in Heat there's clearly good people and bad people, and obviously those are sort of, there's nuances there, and the film discusses it, but ultimately as an audience, he's good, he's bad, he's good, he's bad. Nolan loves to subvert that, so he'll do things like he'll make time an antagonist, he'll make so in the case of Oppenheimer, Louis Strauss's character is a kind of antagonist.
Did you say he'll make time the antagonist rather than the actual person?
So Interstellar, for example, is a great example of throughout the film, time is the antagonist, right? There isn't really an antagonist. There's obviously a few scenes of Matt Damon, but ultimately time is the antagonist because that's who they're facing up against the whole time. Time is almost characterized in that film.
Who's the antagonist in Oppenheimer?
So that's what I was going to say is the interesting thing. So Louis Strauss is... So obviously we're spoiling the film because it's a fucking podcast about the movie. But Louis Strauss is obviously built up as being... To the audience, he's almost like a supporter of Oppenheimer, right? He's building as a supporter. And it was the case, actually, historically, that that was true. But then we start to get nuances in Louis Strauss about his background, certain small moments between himself and Oppenheimer. And then Louis Strauss starts to sort of fall into the backdrop of the United States. So we come to realize as an audience that the United States is playing a key antagonistic role in Oppenheimer's life. So what tends to happen is him antagonizing Louis Strauss, which he does quite openly, both in the movie and historically, ends up obviously buying him on the arse because he has to go through the whole court proceedings, and he finds himself facing a kind of post-nuclear America, which is kind of fronted by Louis Strauss, this kind of post-New Deal, post-atomic bomb United States. And suddenly it's like this giant of a new USA emerges, where we have that great scene we mentioned with Truman. And that is ultimately the antagonist, right? Because we're coming from, because the start of the film, it's all about, the threat of communism. But hold on, we're past that. We're heading into World War II. Hitler is the baddie. And then we get to Japan being the baddie. And then we end it with Oppenheimer as essentially, is he the baddie of it all? So that's why I thought the Louis Strauss character plays so well, because one thing Robert Downey Jr. is so good at doing, and I think why actually, having watched it, he's great for the role, is he maintains charisma all the time, whether he's being an arsehole or whether he's being a good guy. He's charismatic, and it works so well as his role as Louis Strauss, because he's able to pull the strings until they all come undone. He's so good at pulling all the strings.
I mean, that's the main sort of thematic difference, because he has like moral integrity, right? He's not conflicted like Oppenheimer is. And I think that was partly the reason, I guess, behind the fission fusion sort of dichotomy.
I mean, one thing that also the film doesn't do is it doesn't paint just how strange of a character Oppenheimer was, especially in his earlier years. If you read his biography, Oppenheimer was, strange to the point of, a bit of a bizarre character. He was very kind of, this is, again, we're talking about biographies away from the film, but I guess they kind of reflect, because we see a few scenes of him trying to poison the apple and things like that. But he's a character who was very antisocial, to an extent, introverted, maybe a bit of a loser, to use that sort of term. Obviously, he was a genius throughout his whole life, and that showed. But the film doesn't cover just how much of a weirdo he
Yeah,
was. But
yeah.
obviously, it has to sacrifice that.
That's the
to
point that
lean into
Rome was
communism.
making
Yeah.
earlier.
That
Saying
it would be
it
nice
doesn't pick
just
up
to
on those
see that.
aspects.
Yeah, it would be nice
and
to
I
see
agree. Yeah, and I
Because
agree, and I
they-
think it's a sacrifice, but I agree.
that. Because they call themselves fellow travelers, which correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of, they're obviously communists, but they're not officially having joined they haven't officially joined the Communist Party, so they're sympathetic to communism.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing that Oppenheimer, he was never an out and out communism, not in
Yeah,
his
yeah.
real life, not in the movie. And obviously, the question that it poses by the end of it is that, is this guy the ultimate American hero? And if so, why is that not being celebrated, right? And obviously, in his persona, the sort of character flow all the way to that very final scene where he's looking over at that pond is just about how why am I still the loser in all of this, right? Like I've fulfilled my ultimate dream, and now I'm just a killer of 100,000 Japanese people.
Yeah,
So
and
there's
he was kind of used by the government, now's just been sort of disposed, and he might get an award, right? But he's ultimately he could be the reason the Earth fucking explodes.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why Louis Strauss, why I like that character a lot, because he is the sort of puppeteer, and even as things unravel, he plays that role great. And that's obviously is reflected in the filmmaking, which obviously I don't know if you've got more questions, so I don't want to preempt what you're going to ask.
Well, that was question 2.
And that's it for tonight. See you later,
and that's
guys.
it for tonight. Right, so
how many do we have to get through? Should we
we can run through them. I mean, we don't have to use all of them. Okay,
well, if you see how many we get through, yeah, or we can do a kind of quick fire about if you feel the questions merit that.
Well, one of the points that you mentioned earlier, again, is that Nolan shoots this on an IMAX 70mm film camera, and in fact, some of the dialogue scenes that were so big, they made so much noise that they couldn't actually use it for scenes that had dialogue. They had to use a different IMAX camera, but something like that, which for me is that really important when filming, to have the biggest camera. I mean, does it really make a difference compared to all the other films that don't use that? How important is it?
So Nolan, unlike a lot of directors, is dedicated to film, which you got to give him credit for that. He's also dedicated to practical effects instead of visual.
So one
effects.
second. So just for people listening, so when Rowan says film, you mean celluloid over digital?
Yeah, analog celluloid over digital. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, and there's a few directors who do that, but he's the most prolific user of that. But on top of that, he the DOP Hoyt van Hoytma uses a IMAX camera, which is 70mm. And what most analog films are shot on 35, and this is double that. So it's big cameras. Whether the film actually warrants, because most of it is a lot of it is in a dingy back room where they're doing this interrogation, and a lot of it, most of it's interior shots. If they were shooting all of it in the Alamo and we had big beautiful vistas, it would warrant it. But you got to think, like, Nolan's kind of he has these preferences, and he has the money for them, so fine. But it could easily have been done on a 35, and it wouldn't have added much. So I don't know what you think, Dennis.
I mean, look, Rowan's sort of technical expertise maybe trumps mine a little bit, so I can only speak to that kind of final image that we get. I mean, one thing to say, I mean, the whole decision making with IMAX is almost always down to sound, actually, especially with Nolan, because they are super noisy, and a lot of directors these days, they don't like to dub over lines afterwards, because dubbing over is, it's a little bit 1960s. But I've read a few articles, I've seen a few videos of Nolan. I mean, he's basically asked this exact question, and obviously they're sort of poking him to sort of give that reason, because I guess there is a bit of cynicism behind it to say, we're upping the level of cinema a little bit, it's a much bigger screen, it's a bigger experience. And Nolan, the sort of rationale that he gives is that he says things like, for this film, he wanted to see things like face and features and small details on this like huge, because don't forget it's 70mm, but that means that when it's presented, it's a much bigger screen. And I think we both watched it in an IMAX screen. But I think one thing that I respect Nolan a lot for is obviously he loves cinema. And it seems, I mean, the instinct is to say that all directors love cinema, but it's not necessarily true, because to love cinema means you have to give it something. You have to give it something to drive with. And obviously there's been things in the past. Obviously we had the advent of color, and then we had
3D,
bigger and better digital cameras. And then I was going to say, 3D. And now we've kind of reached this sort of new gimmick. Let's call it a gimmick for the time being. Although I don't think.
I mean, 3D is a gimmick. I mean, gimmick is, I guess, it has to outlast like 3 years before it, and it's still around.
But in terms of press junkets and stuff, it's become a bit of a kind of a byword for, just come in and watch it. It's IMAX. But I personally think it does warrant it, and I agree with Rowan to an extent, because obviously there's something awe-inspiring about seeing big vistas, and obviously Dune is coming out next month, and obviously that is going to have a few 70mm scenes, and I mean I can imagine seeing that sort of big desert space. It will look nice, but the one thing that with Nolan is he seems like the more bombastic the better, and why not do it in IMAX? I mean, the film doesn't lose anything from it, and obviously you can still watch it on your laptop or whatever, but I think there are a few scenes, especially with Louis Strauss, these black and white scenes, where you have like the camera just kind of, you feel it just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of moving closer, getting further, moving closer, and you're cutting with all these different things. There's something majestic about those scenes, because it tends to be the case that we watch black and white films, contemporary black and white films, they tend to be indie or European or experimental cinema. But to see this, obviously this massive Hollywood picture in 70mm IMAX, there's something a bit timeless about it, and I think people go back and admire those scenes, and I'm sure it'll have re-releases in cinema and stuff like that. And also, it's a film about the atom bomb, the biggest bomb ever, so I feel like it needs the full 70mm. So I think there's benefits to it, but ultimately it doesn't detract. Like Rowan said, Nolan's got the money, right? He's got the funds, he's got the backing from the studio. That's the most important thing. The studio is obviously ready to back him whatever he wants to do. I think his next film is probably going to be about him, taking a piss in the shower, and they'll fucking give him 300 million. Like, that's how much power this guy has now with the studio.
But you need someone to carry the torch of like old cinema, sort of like analog cinema, because it's being overtaken by a lot cheaper, a lot more sort of convenient
100%.
digital filmmaking,
100%.
Scorsese sort of does it, but Nolan's the main mantle bearer for that.
Yeah, I mean, people look. There's people who've pushed digital cinema a lot. I mean, I mentioned Michael Mann earlier. He's done a lot for digital cinema, and digital cinema has huge benefits. It's made film more, it's made cinema more attainable. I didn't want to say affordable, because obviously digital still costs money, but it's made it more attainable because it's accessible and things like that. But I mean, going back all the way from people like Kubrick, the big spectacle, it needs to be there in cinema. And for people who love film, that shouldn't just come in the form of Marvel, right? There should be spectacle in films that have good subject matter and are not just aimed at selling toys and, things like that. And Nolan is very, very good at, I mean, obviously Cillian Murphy comes at the right place at the right time. Obviously he's been building a bit of a cult following, and then Peaky Blinders has elevated him. So he's come at the right time. He's managed to push the film. Obviously he's got Robert Downey Jr. So all of these things have come together to basically make a sort of big, like I said, almost Kubrickian spectacle out of something that a grown-up can sit and enjoy. And it's, like I said, not just for, 2 months in the cinema and straight on Disney Plus, So I respect him for that, and I have a lot of respect for that.
Okay. There's actually just a little aside. The comparison of Nolan with Kubrick is an interesting one, because he cites Kubrick as one of his biggest influences, and now there has been quite, just looking at Oppenheimer, you obviously have the film about nuclear war, which is I've forgotten. What was it? Hold on.
Are you
Doctor Strange.
Doctor Strangelove?
Doctor Strangelove,
Doctor
which is
Strangelove.
obviously
And
which touches a lot on that period of the Cold War and of nuclear development and everything. Sort of, it's different, but you have parallels there.
Well, I was going to mention it earlier as being one of the few films. Sorry to interrupt, but one of the few films that it was a big film and it touches on that topic. Because as I said earlier, there isn't a lot that touches on.
There isn't really. No.
Yeah, of
touches
nuclear
on
bombs,
that actually the history of it. Yeah, but having said that, it does a completely different way. I mean, Doctor Strangelove is a sort of a bit of a farcical comedy, right? But anyway, back to my point about the comparison. I don't think he reaches the level of Kubrick personally, because he doesn't let things build or characters build the way Kubrick does. Even if you look at something just like scene length, if you just compare those things, the way Kubrick builds up a scene and builds up the tension in a scene, Nolan, that dissipates with a Nolan film because because of the time, flitting back and forth between the chronology and everything, as well as trying to cram so much other stuff into a film. Just about the comparison, what do you think?
I agree that the styles necessarily are not the same. I mean, my point to compare the two was more about they propose a more meaningful cinema. Literally, I mean the word cinema, the trip of going to the cinema, because lest we forget, Kubrick, I mean,
it's almost like an 2001. Event, it's like an opera.
Exactly. Exactly like an opera. And obviously, Kubrick was keen on that kind of sense of opera in 2001 and films like that. And even Eyes Wide Shut is very opera. I think it's based actually on like an old Austrian novel, but it's very operatic. 2001, very operatic.
They cite Beethoven's only opera in that, don't they? Fidelio.
Yeah, it's the password to the
to the Illuminati gathering. Which got Kubrick killed, by the way.
I was just about to say I don't want to use the word sexy, as if we haven't sworn all over this podcast, but to the sex party, I was going to say. But my point was that he presents something new to cinema. And I'm not saying only Nolan does this. We mentioned Paul Thomas Anderson, and there's people like up and coming directors. But a lot of people do this. But Nolan is, at the moment, he sits at the top of that kind of, which I think at one point Kubrick did, and one point Spielberg did. So I think it's important that figure be someone who's presenting something meaningful. And I'm not saying that Nolan is the greatest ever director, but it's the kind of, I'd rather have someone like him sat at the top and bringing cinema into new spaces as opposed to more cynical directors. Because one thing that I think Nolan shows every time.
What do you mean by cynical? That's a complex word. Like, how would you define that? And give me an example.
I was going to say provide an example, because I don't know what you mean.
Cynical. But when I say cynical, I mean there's two ways I think in cinema that we see cynicism. In fact, we started the episode, we talked about things like Oscar bait. But in terms of, we're talking about cinema that really makes money. Cynical tends to be, I'll use an example. So the Marvel universe comes out and it obviously hits this kind of, this zeitgeist of multiverses and things like that. And then you have a bunch of other films that come afterwards, films made by Sony or films made by the DC universe that basically do the same thing.
So it's fantastical and glitzy, but it's not really socially critical or culturally relevant.
Exactly. It just tries to latch on to the last popular thing, and it says, well, we can do it too, because it knows that it's an easy way to throw people's asses into the cinema. And you see trends like that. You see trends that when one like Paranormal Activity comes out, and then there has to be 20 other films about found footage and whatever. And to me, that's a cynical move, because Nolan, let's say if he wants to just count the bucks, right? He wants to just count his money. He can quickly Google, like, what's the last 10 popular films, and say, okay, I'll just jump on doing that, right? But he's shown that he can actually be a bit of a trendsetter, because his films do well
I completely agree with.
Exactly. They do it well in spite of those things, and a lot of the time when you go through because obviously cinema, if you go through the listings, it tends to be the case that most of the films that are shown regularly in cinemas, they're films that are geared towards children or the people that they're going to make the most money from. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but when it starts to get too much, there's a cynicism,
Yeah,
born from it.
it seems that Nolan, listening to him speak and being interviewed, he obviously puts the subject matter ahead of whatever trends in vogue at that time. And it's kind of similar to Kubrick in a way, because he would get so fascinated with the subject matter. I mean, interestingly, he was on the verge of making a Napoleon film, which never got made, and he spent
for years and years,
four or 5 years,
yeah,
completely being inundating himself with knowledge of Napoleon. But and you compare that to a director of Marvel, kind of jumping on bandwagons and stuff, doing it for the money. It's prioritizing the actual subject matter, and that Nolan, to his credit, does that.
Yeah, and he often gets a lot of backlash, albeit it's a social media kind of a bit vacuous backlash, but they'll say things like, "Oh, the science here is wrong," and this, that, and he gets held up almost to an unfair kind of, I think personally, to a kind of unfair standard on small details like that. But I think what it shows is just how much people empathize with his cinema, and for him to be able to get that reaction without having to, obviously he's made the Batman movies, but his Batman movies in no way, I think, are a reflection of other superhero films being made. I think he very much did his own thing, and that showed because people tried their best to emulate after the fact and they weren't able to. But I mean, that's more about Nolan as a sort of director, but I think a lot of that energy he's managed to funnel into this film, and I think his own kind of star power is fed into this film, and a lot of the time the films are a lot about him as a person.
But he has a kind of anti-star power in a way. When you listen to him, he doesn't use social media. He's, as I said, he's not really into the trends of cinema, what the next thing is, right? Maybe that adds to his sort of authority.
It adds to his allure for sure. I mean, because look, he could easily not feature in any interviews and stuff, but he's quite good. He's quite charismatic and he's pretty funny actually. When you actually listen to interviews and things like that, he can stand up against. He goes up against, I don't know who the fuck's chat show, Kimmel or something. He's able to hold his own.
Is it really that hard to stand your own against Jimmy Kimmel, though? It's not exactly hard hitting questions.
Hey, Jimmy
It's not
the best
Paxman.
late night show host ever. I mean, if it was Paxman, thank God that he didn't go on Paxman after making Oppenheimer, because he'd probably ask if Corbyn would have fucking thrown the rocket or something like that. Some stupid shit.
Okay, so next question. According to multiple sources, Cillian Murphy restricted himself to 1 almond a day during parts of filming in order to maintain Oppenheimer's gaunt profile. Now, if that's true, that is dedication, and obviously also dangerous. Do you guys feel it's important to dedicate yourself that much to a role?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say he's already quite gaunt. I mean, he was not like he's gone from a role playing, like a big guy.
The Whale.
Yeah, man. Exactly.
Was that him? Was that him in The Whale?
it might have been him. but yeah, I mean, so yeah, I guess props to him for doing that. But it depends, I guess, how long. How long was he doing that for? Did it say? And 1 almond a day. I mean, you're gonna die pretty soon. I mean, there's not much. It's not much of a balanced diet, is it? Because I know Christian Bale did a tin of tuna and an apple when he was going for The Machinist, right? And he got really fucking thin. But just one singular almond. Okay.
But how big was the almond though? Was it one of those that you get at the airport and it's like he's chewing off it?
Right, next question. Cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema said that not a single frame in the movie was storyboarded. And him and Nolan also preferred, as a matter of principle, shooting as few takes of a scene as possible. So just so we can get an understanding, firstly, what's a storyboard and how important is it to a movie?
This is a big topic, the whole in terms of pre-production and things like storyboarding. the one thing that I'll say is, and using as few takes as possible. I've heard that about Nolan in the past, and I think Rowan and I earlier were talking about him being clinical. So I guess that kind of adds up.
It's funny because Kubrick would take hundreds, so that's another
I was
comparison.
I was literally just about to say, you have directors who are the complete other end of the spectrum, who they're fanatical about. They'll get 50 forms of the same storyboard until they feel it's right. There's people who storyboard to the point of it's like an animation. They feel like it's super important. Obviously, Nolan is someone who's a very big time director who apparently doesn't storyboard. The only thing that I'll say is I find it a bit hard to believe that he at the very least doesn't have some storyboards drawn up for people like costume and things like that, because don't forget, storyboarding isn't just for Hoyt van Hoytema. It's for a lot of other people partake in that process beforehand. But I guess it depends on how you structure your pre-production. But just to keep it on Oppenheimer, I guess one point that I wanted to make, obviously, before we do wrap, is that Oppenheimer, and it follows on from Tenet, because Tenet also has this, it's cut and edited in a very interesting way, and it's obviously born from people who know like things like French New Wave and stuff like that. It's born from this old style of cutting through time and manipulating time in a way using cuts. Nolan is kind of mastering this new wave of it, which I actually wanted to talk about, but it could almost be so an own episode. Maybe we do something on Tenet and Oppenheimer one day. But for him to do that while not storyboarding, if indeed he doesn't storyboard, is massively impressive, because I think, as anyone who's tried to make a film knows, if you don't have a high degree of planning to get those beats out and the edit the way you want it to look, is insanely difficult. So I would love to see what his pre-production strategy is if he doesn't storyboard. But I'll be honest, as someone who's watched the film, it feels like a storyboarded
100%
film. So that's crazy. If he doesn't storyboard, that is insane, I think.
Yeah, there's so much movement going on that it must all be choreographed on some sort of, not storyboard, but obviously it's all been planned rigorously.
Yeah.
Whether as a Hoyt van Hoytema, Nolan sort of thing, where he just has the trust in Hoytema, who's quite a sort of
he's established now. He's the new big.
He's done a lot of great films. Whether he just doesn't need to have it formalized, and he allows Hoytema to run with it.
Sorry guys, just a few technical difficulties. I'm not sure what's going on. Right, so in terms of my final thoughts of the film, so before the episode going in, I had a bit of an idea of what my rating was going to be, which is going to be 8.5. That has actually come down now to an 8. So 8 out of 10. And the reason for that being is, obviously still a great film, but just to pick up on Rowan's point earlier, is that I would have liked to have seen different dimensions of Oppenheimer's character. Not when he's just always concentrating on work. If we would have seen that side of him, I think it would have completed that sort of biography of Oppenheimer, where we see different sides. Overall, still love the film. I still recommend everyone to go and watch it. I had the privilege of seeing it twice in the cinema, and it is a spectacle in itself. But overall, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10, which is, again, still very high. And obviously, it's definitely worthy of winning the Oscar, in my opinion, so far from the movies we've done. But yeah, 8 out of 10 for me.
Okay. And Rowan?
Fair enough, yeah. Okay, I'm going to give it a 7. Because, I mean, we have to kind of look at it in the context of it's been reviewed by a lot of people, critics and online critics, of being like best film of the year, or even the best film of the 21st century. I really don't think it stands up to that, because it doesn't. I mean, I don't think it's adding much new as a film. It feels, a lot of the film has kind of like a Ron Howard Beautiful Mind meets like JFK.
Well, that's a
type
diss, man.
thing.
That's a diss. The Ron Howard thing's a diss.
A lot of it felt like that. But then it also added on top of that. There's the Nolan time obfuscation, the messing with chronologies, which just doesn't let any scene or character build enough. He's trying to cover so much and come back to things and everything. It's done ironically from too much of a scientific approach, I want to see the character. I want to let the concepts evolve. So for those reasons, but technically it's great, and it's a great film, and it reflects the history in an interesting way. So for that, I give it credit. But it's Nolan's, albeit subjective opinion on Nolan, which brings it down to a 7.
Imagine if Nolan listens to this. So not only have you brought Bardi's rating down with your point, he's furious about that. But then you've also there he is. But you've also compared him to Ron Howard.
I'm cool with that. So if you watch it, a beautiful mind kind of came through in a few scenes.
No, I because I'm joking a little bit. I think it did, and I would even say maybe a bit conscious. The topic lends itself to that. But wait, to not overrun. I'll give it my review. I'm gonna actually give it the same rating as Bardi. I'm gonna also say 8 out of 10. I think is majestic at times. I think that. It has a kind of this kind of sweeping, flowing editing that I'm kind of enamored with. There's not a lot of films that I've seen that do it, and it's rare that you see something new in something so large scale. Normally, you end up seeing these new things in more experimental films and more indie films, but for him to do it on a large scale, I respect that a lot. I do like the performances. I agree with you guys that there's problems and that sometimes it's flat. That's a very Nolan type thing, but he pulls it off. That it's missing a 2 because I think 1, it doesn't lean into the politics, and I think you can't have an atom bomb without it being a lot more political than what that film was. And also there are some moments where maybe I would have either leaned in more or would have just cut it. Like I said, a few early scenes, stuff like that, I felt maybe a bit half-assed, but maybe upon rewatching they'll settle in my mind more. But the only thing that I will say to people who are into the Trinity test and atom bombs, if you watch Twin Peaks, they do the best Trinity test scene ever.
I forgot about that. Yeah,
I can't spoil it, but they do something so good with the Trinity test. But Oppenheimer, it's still a great film, and I give it an 8 out of 10. And so far, I mean, we've only done 2, but yeah, it's the strongest of what we've reviewed so far, and I guess we can keep that ball rolling. But yeah,
okay,
cool, guys. It's been a pleasure knowing you.
Nice.
We're ending at a perfect time. My laptop's on like 6% battery, which has never been that
beautiful.
low ever.
And to be honest, this format is a winner. It makes things a lot more free flow.
For sure.
So this is
okay.
good. Nice. All right, guys. So we have past lives next, I think.
Okay, nice. See you next week, lads.
All right, guys, need to head off. Ciao.
Bye. See you. Bye. It's still on. Ah!